Good afternoon. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast live online for Wednesday, September 23rd. We are very happy to welcome you to another program where we're going to be talking with one of our champions of broadband. And this, I've been looking forward to this for some time. We're going to have Rob McDowell, former FCC commissioner, and very active continually, both before and since his time at the FCC in communications matters, broadband matters. And actually, since we started this program in mid-March, right as the coronavirus pandemic hit, I've actually been wanting to have Commissioner McDowell on this program. I had invited him to a previous event, but for reasons we'll speak about, he wasn't able to attend. We are very excited, though, now not only to welcome you to this program and to our discussion, and I'll bring our guest on in just a moment, but also to remind you that next week on the 30th of September, we'll have Sunny McPeak from the California Emerging Technology Fund, and she will be our final champion of broadband in this series. We've been doing this for about 2 months. We've had a number of esteemed guests, including former acting chairman Mignon Clyburn and Jim Baller, Tom Hazlett, Bob Frankston, and others. And so we're really grateful to have these two speakers, guests on the program today and next week. Let me go ahead and bring our guest on. Thank you so much for joining us, Robert. Really appreciate you making the time to be with us from your home in, is it Fairfax? Is that right?
Fairfax County in Virginia. Yes, sir. Thank you for having me. It's great to see you.
Well, welcome, and we're really grateful. Now, this is a very exciting time. You tweeted a day or two ago about, oh, there's nothing really to talk about, and of course, you were teasing. Of course, there's a lot to talk about, and I want to start off with just the politics of the FCC right now, and I mean right now. I mean, obviously, we have a Republican chairman. We've got Ajit Pai is the chairman, and there's 2 commissioners. So the way the FCC is structured, of course, is that it's 5 commissioners, 3 of one party and 2 not of that party, and the president of the United States picks the chairman. So in the event that there were a change of party as the president, there would have to be a change in chairman come inauguration day. So, but then there's another dimension, which is how long commissioners serve on their terms. And there is a commissioner right now, Commissioner Michael O'Reilly, who was all set to be renominated, all set to be confirmed, and then President Trump pulled his nomination at the last minute. So let's talk a little bit about this, both the substance of what appeared to trip up Commissioner O'Reilly, but also kind of how this is going to play out in terms of the numbers on the commission. So you feel free to address this however you'd like, Commissioner.
Sure. Well, first of all, Drew, great to see you, and thank you for having me today. It's labeled Broadband Breakfast, but I actually have pieces of my lunch sitting right here. So it's, 5 o'clock somewhere as the song goes.
If you're in California, it's breakfast. So.
Exactly. So, and if you're in the UK, hopefully some are, then it's dinner time or tea time. Mike O'Reilly's an old friend of mine. I've known him for probably about a quarter century. I do think it's unfortunate what has happened. So for those who don't know, he was renominated. He was not originally a Bush appointee. He was a Trump appointee. Scrap that. He was not a Trump appointee. He was an Obama appointee. And this was the first time he'd been nominated by President Trump. He had cleared the FBI background check, of course, and all the vetting, and had cleared the committee. He was voted out of the Senate Commerce Committee and was ready to go to the floor. A hold, unrelated to this, a hold had been placed on his nomination by Senator Inhofe, who's chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, who was very upset over a vote regarding legato networks, and wanted the commissioner to change his mind on that vote. At the same time, roughly the same time, within a few days, and this is based on press accounts, Mike had given a speech on his thoughts regarding the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which was passed in 1996 on a very bipartisan basis, It's actually housed inside Section 2 of the Communications Act of 1934. And that's important for a number of reasons to understand. But President Trump on May 28th had signed an executive order directing the Department of Commerce to file a petition for rulemaking at the FCC to amend the liability shield that social media platforms have as the result of Section 230. And so they're not liable for third-party content that gets posted onto their sites, and they're not liable for reasonable curation of those sites. So there's this important liability issue. Anyway, so Mike, I think, is concerned about the executive order and the pending petition for rulemaking that had already been filed. Spoke before the Media Institute on that, and apparently that got picked up by the Trump White House. Again, this is according to press accounts, and that was not in line with the Trump administration policy, even though he was just asking questions. If you read the speech, he's asking questions. And that was ostensibly the reason for the president pulling his nomination. Republican Senate leadership have been trying to revive his nomination. He's very well regarded, actually on both sides of the aisle, but by Senate Republican leadership, who would have the most influence with the White House, one would think. And apparently that's not the case. So he will serve, his term is up, so he has to leave by matter of statute when the Senate adjourns, sine die, as we call it, and that's technically January 2nd or 3rd, it reconvenes, so maybe the 3rd, you can spot an extra day there. But functionally, it'll be by New Year's, unless someone else is confirmed. So until then, in which case he has to leave as soon as that person is sworn in. I think that's unlikely. There just aren't enough legislative days to confirm a new commissioner. And now we have a Supreme Court nomination, in case nobody caught that news over the weekend. So I think that might take up a lot of the Senate's time and bandwidth. So anyway, long-winded explanation for this.
Well, the reason I'm asking is because I know you've got opinions about both ends of this, both the substance and the procedure. And let's take the substance first, okay? So Commissioner McDowell, does the FCC have authority over this rulemaking, this Section 230 rulemaking? And let's talk through it. You did mention it's in Title II of the Communications Act, but help the normal reader understand, like, why we're importing a fairness doctrine on steroids into the Communications Act.
So, and I'm speaking only in my personal capacity. I'm a partner at Cooley, large international law firm that has many clients interested in this from a variety of perspectives. I'm not speaking on their behalf. The FCC has never recognized that it has any jurisdiction to promulgate rules under Section 230. Time and again, when that's come up in narrow context, whether it's so-called net neutrality or other things, the commission on a bipartisan basis has always said, we don't really have any authority here. It's called the Communications Decency Act, to your point, but it is technically housed in Title II of the Communications Act. Title II was created in 1934 and is what was used to regulate telephone companies. And it was also the statutory basis for the Tom Wheeler 2015, the Wheeler-led FCC, to classify broadband internet access for the first time as a telecommunications service. Okay, all that's important because the law is important here, not to put people to sleep. What it actually does is it creates a liability shield. So the idea back in 1996 was the internet and the websites at the time, as they were kind of called, was still nascent. They were still startups and small. If a user posts their content on a website, it could be an unlimited number of contexts. It could be a review of a product, like I tried this product, it stinks, or I love it, either way. Or it could be an opinion about a news story or any number of things, right? That the idea was the website, the social media platform, didn't want to be exposed to liability to be sued for things such as defamation. If a third party posted something that was untrue or defamatory, the social media platform did not want to be exposed to that. And so it is thought that Section 230 has helped create the dialogue, free speech on the internet, right? Now, what the petition for rulemaking filed by Department of Commerce does suggest or does ask for is for the FCC to kind of reshape what are sort of the good faith aspects of a social media platform shaping the content on its website. So for instance, if it's going to curate or have editorial discretion, one of the questions is, well, why shouldn't they then, and now the internet is matured and some of these social media platforms are some of the largest companies in the world, why shouldn't they be exposed to the same amount of liability that, let's say, a newspaper is, or a broadcaster is, or a linear cable channel is, right? So those are all curated. You have editorial discretion. And if you say something defamatory, you could be sued for defamation, among other things. That's kind of what's in play here, but there's a lot going on. So to finally answer your question is—
No, this is important. This is the key issue. And just today, press reports have reported that the administration sent over legislative proposals dealing with Section 230. So yeah, tell us your views on whether it's appropriate that there is this extra level of immunity for internet platforms, as opposed to, you just went through linear cable channels, newspapers, etc.
Right. So there's parts of this which seem outrageous to some, and there are parts of this which actually, on a bipartisan basis, if you rewind the tape to right after the 2016 election, you had members of Congress on both sides of the aisle talking about Section 230 and whether or not, in their words, sort of big tech should have this special immunity that no one else has in the media space, right? That could be a worthwhile public policy debate and discussion of what's the best way to shape this. And whenever you introduce the T word, President Trump, then all of a sudden the tenor changes in a lot of debates. So there is a lot going on here. My view is the FCC, the Communications Decency Act does not give the FCC the power to issue rules defining the terms of Section 230, that is Congress's job. You've had both Republican and Democratic members of Congress say that. I just had, for a Cooley virtual town hall, I think it was on July 1st, Greg Walden, who's the ranking Republican of the House Energy and Commerce Committee and was the chairman of that committee, say the same thing. He said, yeah, I think this is Congress's job. I don't think he wanted to, he's retiring, I don't think he wanted to necessarily make news, but it's on the Cooley website, you can take a look for yourself. That's what he said. And others have said the same thing, which is interesting debate now. I mean, it's a different world from 1996. We can all agree on that. There are First Amendment implications here that social media platforms clearly have First Amendment rights, as a newspaper does. But should they be liable? And that the liability shield aspect of this does get lost in the debate. Anyway, it's my personal view that the FCC does not really have the authority to issue rules in this space. If the FCC ends up issuing rules, so if either way with this election, I know the two Democratic commissioners have said they're opposed to this petition. So if Biden wins, I assume that this proceeding withers on the vine. But I wouldn't just end it there. I think that this conversation is going to continue. It'll either continue in Congress or at the FCC. In that people have been awakened to the fact, even though it's been sleeping there since 1996, that Section 230 is in Title II of the Communications Act. So if you classify broadband as a telecom service, and maybe now do you have this extra hook? This is just like a law review article type, theoretical academic discussion here. But
you're teeing the next issue up, Commissioner.
But does Section 230 give the FCC or someone else an extra hook into the edge, into content providers? And by the way, large content providers have thousands of miles of fiber that connect servers and routers all over the country, all over the world. So while they may not offer telecommunications services for a fee to the public, as Title II says, that's not the end of the debate necessarily over how far could the FCC's jurisdiction be expanded. So I think regardless of who wins the election, this issue will continue to be debated, and something could end up happening either from the Hill or through the FCC. And I just don't know what it is.
Isn't it possible that President Trump has either inadvertently or deliberately introduced a new poison pill into net neutrality legislation? In other words, if Congress wants to tackle, a Democratic Congress wants to tackle net neutrality, impose net neutrality rules, or a new Democratic FCC, if there were to be switch administrations, try to redo the rules that have now gone back and forth multiple times. Have you just pointed out that there now might be some content grounds that would impact net neutrality rules?
Excellent question, as usual. So yes, this was even a topic of conversation in 2010 when FCC Chairman Julius Genachowski in May of 2010 started a notice of proposed rulemaking regarding Title II classification of internet access. That ended up not being the case. He relied on Title I and Section 706 in the December of 2010 order. But Republicans in Congress along the way in 2010 were saying, well, if you're going to do this, be careful what you wish for, because there's the Section 230. You have to dig for it, but you can find those discussions. And it's something at the time I tried to warn social media platforms and other sort of quote internet companies about at the time, which is you're inviting the government to regulate in your space. And I know you think it's just ISPs that they're regulating, but actually it's hard to invite the government into your neighborhood and say, just please regulate my neighbor, but not me. Or in this case, please regulate my rival, but not me, because there's a whole issue of ad tech and things that could ISPs get into that business. So it tends to be a one-way ratchet. I always like to tell people that about regulation. It tends to only go up and rarely go down. And also, always be careful what you wish for. I've always said that, when you distill the vast majority of requests I got as a commissioner, it came down to please regulate my rival, but not me. And sometimes years later, those parties would regret their initial request.
We'll come back to net neutrality, I promise, but let me just come back and the other side of the question, the fairness doctrine side of it. And the irony, of course, is that the Republicans have been singularly almost motivated against the fairness doctrine under Dennis Patrick. They killed the fairness doctrine at the FCC. Reagan and Bush both vetoed measures that would have reinstated it. It's been an article of faith among Republicans for years and years that there be no requirement of fairness or neutrality. And yet we're seeing the exact opposite posture from President Trump and many allies who say that 230, quote, requires neutrality or requires to. So I just like your comment as someone who's kind of been in the trenches at the FCC for, nearly a decade. How did you see this fairness doctrine and the vestiges of the fairness doctrine playing itself out?
So, and actually, interestingly, you raised that. So, in early 2011, I believe, the Obama White House said, this is after the 2010 by-elections that went the Republicans' way. The Obama White House said, all the regulatory agencies, let's look for rules that we could get rid of, regulations that we could get rid of. And actually, one of my legal advisors happened to look in the Code of Federal Regulations and saw the fairness doctrine was still in the Code of Federal Regulations. The Reagan era order just said we're not going to enforce it. And so I raised that in a speech, and then to Julius Genachowski, who was terrific to work with, by the way. And he said, let's get rid of it. Let's just erase it from the book. So that happened as a result of a bipartisan effort. For those who don't know, what the fairness doctrine came along in the wake of World War II during the Truman era, when there was a concern that either fascists or communists, literally, I'm not making this up, would be able to sort of take over a substantial portion of basically only AM radio stations. There were about 1,000 of them, or not even 1,000 of them at the time in the late 1940s. No FM yet, and then very little. TV was in its infancy, and political speech needed to be regulated so that communists or fascists couldn't use these big influencers as propaganda platforms. And that was the basis of the fairness doctrine, which said you have to provide all sides of a debate, both sides, is how it was phrased, really, with a chance to give their opinion if your broadcast outlet is providing political opinion. Well, for those of us who love the First Amendment, of course, political speech is core protected speech under the First Amendment. That's kind of the part of it. Was actually appealed in 1969 in something called the Red Lion case. It was a religious broadcaster who was railing against somebody. I can't remember all the facts. He lost his license. his broadcast license. Went all the way to the Supreme
It
Court.
was Raylan against Johnson at the
Was that
time.
what it was?
It took a while to get there. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, and both, by the way, both Republican presidents, JFK, Johnson, Nixon, others, have all tried to use the FCC to influence speech. So there's a long sordid history of this, which I don't agree with and I disagree with on a bipartisan basis. So I went to Supreme Court, 1969, red line case, and it basically said, I'm oversimplifying, this is a core political speech, but because of something called spectrum scarcity, meaning that there are very few outlets, there are possible outlets for radio and then TV stations, the government has the right on a limited, narrowly tailored basis to regulate speech. But it goes on to say, if later you want to come back to us and say that there's competition in the media space, we'll take another look at this. And that was pretty forward-looking. That was 1969. So it was actually upheld. I don't think a subsequent Supreme Court would uphold the fairness doctrine. So anyway, long-winded way of saying that was, in my view, unconstitutional government regulation of core political speech. And I've always been opposed to that. There's some who argue that the Section 230 petition is all about the FCC and Department of Commerce and others getting into the game of saying, if you're a social media platform, you better be more even-handed or balanced in how you curate the content that's political speech. And that if you look at the context of when President Trump signed the executive order in May, and conservatives think that some of the larger social media platforms skew liberal and discriminate against conservative voices, and they may. We could take that academically and say they may. I think they have a First Amendment right to do so. If Twitter wants to only allow people with left-leaning views to tweet, that's its prerogative, and someone could start a right-leaning Twitter, in my view. So, from an academic perspective, we could debate that. Does the government want to get into the business of forcing companies to balance speech? That's what some are saying is happening as a result of this order or this rulemaking. Others look at it to say, well, maybe we're not saying that. Maybe we just say they have every right to curate and exercise editorial discretion, but then they lose their liability shield and have to be just like a newspaper or a broadcaster or a linear cable channel. We don't know where it's going to go. So we don't, the idea of this is a fairness doctrine for the internet was one of the arguments I had against especially Title II, which is, again, be careful what you wish for, everybody. More regulation in the space is necessarily a good thing. So we'll see where it goes. And then it'll, if President Trump's reelected and the FCC does come out with some order next year, I think, it'll be the same as next spring, it'll be appealed.
Yeah. Well, we have one of our active viewers, Sean McLaughlin's asked, what happened to localism? That's a word we haven't mentioned yet, and there may be critics. I'm sure I can be critical of it, but that is part of the language, or at least the doctrine that's evolved around the public interest, convenience, and necessity language in the Communications Act. So, do you have any reaction to that point, or the follow-on question he asks about Patty Minsk versus WHAR, which I'm not familiar with, about the fairness doctrine and affirmative obligation to present programs. What are your thoughts on kind of close out this question of the fairness doctrine and localism and spectrum scarcity, as ill-begotten as that concept might have been in the red line decision, and what it means for today when we're in an era of information abundance rather than scarcity?
Information and disinformation. So, yeah, this show again, spectrum scarcity is the theory that gives the government, in theory, the ability to shape content through one medium, through one conduit, and that's broadcasting. So a linear cable channel doesn't have to, you can drop the F-bomb on a linear cable channel and you won't get fined, for instance. If you drop the F-bomb on free over-the-air broadcasting, you'll get fined. It's actually, by the way, under the criminal code, Title 18 of the U.S. Code, indecency is. Something I learned once I was a commissioner, by the way. So that's kind of scary. So localism is very important. So the whole idea behind localism and granting the licenses to broadcasters is, are you serving your local community of license? There is, because broadcast signals only reach so far over the air, there is a natural sort of, in my view, built-in incentive for them to have as many listeners if you're radio or viewers if you're a TV station tuning in to your show. So that would be interest, the public, the local public's interest in your content is probably going to be driven more by market forces than anything else. So if people don't find it relevant to their lives, they're not going to tune in. And especially in this world, so to answer the question, Sean's question there, which is a great question, in the world where the internet kind of internationalizes, globalizes, or nationalizes topics of conversation, obviously a lot of exceptions, you have local Facebook groups, et cetera, but that it tends to be more global or national in character and not as local. That's where, let's say, a local radio broadcaster or a local TV station can fill in the gap. So there are some investors who've been coming into the broadcasting game just in the past couple of years saying, you know what, the different local news, for instance, gathered by a local TV station when newspapers have died in a lot of communities, that's it, is local news gathering. It's only being funded by a TV station. So that provides an immediate economic incentive to actually provide local content. So that's at the heart of localism. And actually, in a way, while the internet has disrupted local broadcasting, we've seen their revenues decline by about 40% when adjusted for inflation over the past few years. That's a lot. Advertising revenue. That localism niche, that local news and content generally provides them a niche, which I think consumers still value.
Well, let's step back to the highest level on the FCC here and talk a little about what is the role of the FCC. Now, you of course joined the Communications Commission in 2006, and this was during the Bush administration. So you were a Republican pick of a Republican president. You described O'Reilly as an Obama pick, but we have to clarify that it's not. He's a minority pick, meaning the Republican. So I guess maybe let me frame this way. When I first started covering the FCC many years ago, I used to think about it more as, oh yeah, it's kind of like an independent agency, but it's really more executive branch. I've come to think of it as more a mini Congress, right? A mini version of Congress. So I'd love your take on that. As an independent agency, it's neither, of course, but what does it act more like? Does it quack like a duck, or does it quack like a hen, right? And tell us a little bit about how you fit into this as a Republican appointee in 2006, and then basically working in both the majority and the minority.
Excellent question. So I love that job for 7 years. I mean, after 7 years, it was time to go. But you are truly independent like a federal judge. And that's how Congress created it in 1934. So while you're appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, the president can't fire you altogether from the commission. It's an independent agency in that regard. The president does designate who the chair is, and can undesignate you and designate someone else if the president doesn't like you. I don't think that's ever happened. And the Senate can remove you through impeachment, and knock on wood, that's never happened to the FCC commissioner. So you are given tremendous independence. And your viewers should know too that the vast majority, even today, of votes are bipartisan in nature. I think
that's not a lot of non-controversial stuff, right? I mean, are you saying substantive stuff goes through bipartisan?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, for instance, spectrum policy, that's still a bastion of bipartisanship. A lot of enforcement matters are. And that's a lot of what the FCC does. So a lot of universal service matters. I think we'll probably have a vote on this, is spectrum related, on TV white spaces, the use for broadband of unlicensed, unused TV channels. That's been historically bipartisan. I'm guessing hopefully this fall we'll have a 5-0 vote on that. So it's more than you think. It might not be the stuff that grabs the headlines. And it's, if you're a reporter, both my parents were journalists. I have my father's National Geographic's behind me. He was a senior editor for National Geographic. You like conflicts, and so readers like to read about conflict. So the stories that are going to get the most attention are the ones where there's some conflict for the most part. But still, to this day, the vast majority of votes are bipartisan or maybe even unanimous. That said, those high-profile cases matter a lot. And whether it's things like the classification of broadband as a telecom service, some call that net neutrality, or media ownership, the ownership rules governing broadcasters tends to fall along party lines. Still, to this day, even with the internet kind of overwhelming all of us in the media space. So also the statute says, so the 5-commissioner statute says that the president may not appoint more than 3 of the same political party. So you could have hypothetically 3 Democrats, a communist, and a Green Party, right? So those would be, but they would be, maybe philosophically more left of center. But what has happened since the President Clinton and Bob Dole in the Senate is that the Senate out of White House party, so the minority party in that regard, kind of work together on who the 2 minority picks will be. So I was first nominated by President Bush, and I was renominated by Barack Obama, and I was the first Republican he appointed to an independent agency, which is kind of cool. So.
So the first in his administration, meaning 2013.
2009, actually. So to an independent agency. Not,
yes.
Some say, well, Bob Gates was Secretary of Defense, and actually he wasn't appointed. He just kept on serving. He wasn't appointed by Obama. He just kept on serving. He was a Bush appointee. So.
Well, okay. So to the question of O'Reilly, and when he leaves, when the Senate adjourns, and presuming there has not been a new appointment, although Symington has been put forward to the Senate as a new appointee, but presuming that doesn't happen, are we going to be in a 2-2 situation, right? And what happens then in terms of, let's talk about these transition periods, right? And what happens with the chairmanship and the I guess what I'm really trying to get at is who picks the out-of-party persons for the commission.
So first of all, the commission throughout its 86-year history has survived just fine when it's evenly divided along party lines. So don't worry about that. It'll continue to do its job. I hope that's still true. So yeah, we can go through a number of hypotheticals. So if Mike leaves, Sonny died at the end of this calendar year. If Trump is reelected, then you have 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, and you have to wait for that 3rd Republican to get reconfirmed. That could take a long time, depending on things, right? So Congress doesn't even get organized. It'll be a new Congress. They won't even get organized. They won't even have all the committees appointed till maybe even late February. But cabinet appointees get priority in the queue ahead of FCC commissioners, which are considered sub-cabinet. So it could be March or April before you get that 3rd Republican. And maybe it's quicker, maybe it's not, depends on if the Senate changes hands and all that. Could be later. But the commission will carry on. And then, again, under the hypothetical, if President Trump is reelected, you would have Ajit Pai there and Commissioner Carr on the Republican side, and Commissioner Rosenworcel and Commissioner Starks on the Democratic side. I don't know who would, I assume so long as Ajit is there, he would remain as chairman, and maybe you need 2 Republicans then appointed if Ajit's planning on leaving, which we don't know that he is, by the way. So then if Joe Biden is elected president, traditionally the out-of-party chairman steps down on January 20th altogether, not just as chair, but altogether from the commission. So if that tradition is stuck with you, you'd have Mike O'Reilly gone and Ajit gone, you'd have a 2-to-1 commission, 2 Democrats, 1 Republican, Brendan Carr. I was at the commission in 2009. One of the happiest times was when it was 2-to-1. It was led by acting chair Mike Copps and Commissioner Jonathan Adelstein and then myself. In the first half of 2009, we worked on the digital television transition. We had 50 votes together, all unanimous votes, and it was a pretty happy time, actually. It was the era of the 3 amigos, we call it. Those are stories that don't get written about in Washington,
and it's great. It's great to highlight that, right? I mean, because you've been in almost every possible permutation, right? With the Democrat, the Republican,
Yeah. So yeah, Republican president, Republican Congress, Republican president, Democratic Congress, Democratic president, Democratic Congress, Democratic president, Republican Congress, over my 7 years. So yeah, it was pretty much every permutation you can think of. I've been in the majority, the minority. Some say when I was technically in the majority, I was actually still in the minority for a variety of reasons. But anyway, you covered it back then. So but the work goes on, and the FCC has 15 or 1,600 career civil servants, engineers, and lawyers, and other professionals, economists, who are all working on all these issues all the time. And it's a fabulous group of public servants, and I miss working with them. So folks watching should know that the core functions of making sure there's enough spectrum up and running so that people's devices work and all that sort of thing, that continues even between presidencies.
Uh-huh. But as to this question of to whom does the FCC really report? I mean, and again, O'Reilly's unusual circumstance raises this anew. You raise yourself that the president, I guess, has the theoretical power to withdraw the chairmanship from a member of his own party and appoint someone else. So is it no longer, if it ever was, insulated from executive branch pressure? Is it, by contrast, subject to legislative branch pressure, or do you feel like, oh no, we were cool, we could do what we wanted, we just had to go up every so often and go to the woodshed at Senate committee? I mean, how did you think of it when you were commissioner?
Yeah, so I viewed it, and I think Commissioner O'Reilly views it the same way, and maybe others too, again, as more judicial, so that you're more of a federal judge and not a legislator. So I didn't, I could have been the first commissioner on Twitter and chose not to be. I could have been the first commissioner on Facebook and chose not to be. I didn't think that was my role. It should be more judicial. So, and you are insulated as a matter of law. There have been many times in the commission's history, I think I pointed out earlier, under JFK, LBJ, Nixon, when there would be White House pressure on the FCC to crack the whip against some broadcasters because the president wasn't getting favorable coverage, and that goes way back. We saw it again in 2014, late 2014, when President Obama had a famous YouTube video saying that Title II was the way to go in the net neutrality debate. And the sort of analysis was that Tom Wheeler changed his assessment from Title I to Title II as a result of that communication, albeit public through YouTube, from President Obama. By the way, my theory is that I think Tom would have gone there anyway. He would have gone to Title II anyway, but legitimate questions of independence at that point. And then now, with the O'Reilly nomination, questions of independence. So when you're vulnerable is when you're being appointed. Once you're there for a 5-year term, although nobody's term, the clock ticks whether you're in the chair or not, so nobody starts or stops their term on time. But anyway, that's for argument's sake, say it's a 5-year term. So the president can't fire you altogether from the FCC. See, that does give you a fair amount of independence. I can't think of another, other than like the judiciary, what other jobs that are like that, or the FTC and other independent agencies. So I always felt as if I had tremendous independence. It lifts a whole degree of stress off your shoulders. Yes, to your point, you go before Congress, as it should be. They are the directly elected representatives of the American people. They have oversight hearings, as they should, and they push and prod and ask questions, and they can yell at you, and they can pass legislation directing you to do something. Whether you agree with it or not, you have to do it, if that's what the legislation says. And they can cut off your funding to keep you from doing things. And that's how democracy, the sausage making of democracy, works. But other than that, I mean, that's hard to do. It's hard to pass legislation. I always enjoyed the debate, and maybe there's something wrong with me. I always enjoyed congressional oversight hearings because I wanted to hear what they were saying, and I wanted to hear what my colleagues were saying, because under the Sunshine and Government Act, the FCC commission, no more than 2 FCC commissioners can meet at a time without it being a public meeting and publicly noticed. So it was always hard to kind of figure out in real time what we were all thinking. So I would listen and take notes to what my colleagues were saying. So I enjoyed those, and I thought it was very healthy. Others don't enjoy that so much and get intimidated. A lot depends on the personality of the commissioner, whoever the commissioner is for that particular seat. And as to whether or not they will be intimidated by that, whether or not they get intoxicated with the position, everyone telling you you're really smart and funny and all this stuff, which or the cardboard cutout that's created. You're evil, you're an angel, one of the two. You just got to step away from all that and just stick to the facts of the law and try to do the best you can.
Yeah.
But I don't know if those days are over. And one quick thing to add is, and I don't mean to pin this on the Obama administration at all, I think an unintended consequence of tightening ethics regulations in terms of people's background, it's harder to appoint people to a lot of positions due to conflicts of interest. And while that's a good thing, I'm not saying you should loosen ethical restrictions. The Obama administration tightened that. And essentially there was, I'm going to oversimplify this, a 2-year look back on if you were at a law firm and even if you didn't personally represented company X that was in a particular industry, you couldn't work on those issues. So that means your field of candidates are limited to government, think tanks, and academia.
Well, you've teed up a couple of things that lead us to this other issue I really want to drill in on, and net neutrality, kind of historically today, and let's call it the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future, because you came into the FCC having been, senior vice president, general counsel of CompTel, which of course represented competitive telecommunications companies, and was often on the other side of them. I don't quite remember their posture on net neutrality, if that was a thing then, but you kind of came in with one sort of set of associations and affiliations, and I don't know whether that look back would have affected you personally had it been in place, but did you kind of change? I mean, I don't mean to say this in a bad way, Commissioner. Did you change your view from being one that would have been more sympathetic to net neutrality to being more critical of net neutrality because of some perception that was the Republican position you needed to adopt when you were on the commission from 06 to 13?
Excellent question. And yes, by the way, I was a registered lobbyist when I got the phone call from Senator Ted Stevens asking me if I wanted to serve in the commission. So that's the last time that's ever going to happen, I'm sure. So, and I had an ethics agreement with the Senate Commerce Committee for a year. I couldn't work on certain issues, and I was notoriously recused from the AT&T Bell South merger. Anyway, that's another story. But actually, that was the first time that anything net neutrality, which has no, that's why I keep doing this, net neutrality has no legal definition. Net neutrality, people think they know what it means, but then you start asking, and it's all over the place. So that was the first time that actually was codified as a merger condition in the AT&T Bell South deal that I was recused from. That was December of 06. So yes, my background was working with network operators. At the time, I was nominated and confirmed. CompTel, my employer, and its members did not have a position on the regulation of broadband internet access, and that came later. I think they adopted one long after I left. So that wasn't my job anymore. I mean, I said to my team, my wonderful legal advisors that I was so blessed to have for 7 years, they said, I don't care what your last job was. I don't know what you're thinking about what your next job is going to be. This is the only job that matters right now, and we follow the facts and the law. So my question on net neutrality was in 06, 07, 08, my whole time that I was there, what's broken that we're trying to fix, and how are we fixing it? And are there other tools to fix it if something's broken? So the beginning of the flow chart was what's broken. And I kept coming back to that after we would do an analysis every time this came up and say, there's really nothing broken here. But the parade of horribles that gets discussed to justify more regulation in the space is fixed. It's already presumptively illegal conduct under antitrust law and Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act. So Sherman Act and Clayton Act under antitrust and others. And that's probably one reason why it hasn't happened. Plus, there's some market forces happening. So in 06, we were still in the 3G world, but the promise of 4G was coming. We worked on a spectrum auction that started in 2007 that was going to bring us 4G, and that was going to be somewhat of a competitor to fixed broadband. Plus, there was a lot of unlicensed spectrum being deployed. So whether that was Wi-Fi or TV white spaces. So these were all conduits that competed against fixed broadband, let's say cable modem, and provided a check and a balance against anti-competitive conduct. So I kept looking at that because my philosophy was we're not just going to adopt rules just in case, because new rules always have unintended consequences. And one of which is you start getting questions from investors like, well, what does this rule mean? How's it going to be enforced? How's it going to be appealed in the courts? And that goes on for years. And so while it's not the end of the world, either way, but while it's not the end of the world, it does cause a pause or trims the sails, at least around the edges, but in a measurable way, on potential investment and throughout the ecosystem. That affects the whole ecosystem. So I said, we got to be very careful before we just start adopting willy-nilly new regulatory regimes. I want to see something broken. So that's how I approached it. So my former employer didn't have a position at the time I left it on this issue. And it was intellectually interesting to me. But I just didn't think there was a problem that needed fixing. I mean, I, by the way, still don't. It's still my personal opinion.
No, okay, no, you've given a good defense for no net neutrality rules. Of course, many who look back on the Janikowski administration, its approach to it, would basically say, I mean, many would kill for those rules, right? Because they were Title I rules. And then, of course, Wheeler, and you've already previewed this a little bit, Wheeler might have been on track for a Title II approach to net neutrality, but for Obama's YouTube in 2014, that you said he would have gone there anyway. Others said, well, he was politically pressured to go to Title II. And that, of course, is, by all accounts, a much greater and more substantive change, speaking regulatorily, to net neutrality. So I guess my question is Title I net neutrality worse than Title II? And how are we going to solve this problem that every administration, this has been it's gone back and forth. Are we going to see that process again if we have another party as president?
Yeah, I do think we'll continue to see this debate unless Congress steps in and can adopt something which has eluded it, right? So in 2009 and 2010, when Democrats controlled 60% of each chamber plus the White House, there was an attempt to codify legislation in this area, and it didn't happen. Now there's been a lot of turnover in Congress in those 10 years. There's another attempt in I think around the time of the Wheeler, so 2014, 2015, there were some bipartisan talks, but they didn't go anywhere. So look, I think all folks on both sides of the debate, or some folks on both sides of the debate, would welcome congressional action if something could be codified. What the something is obviously the hard part. Title II does bring with it, I'm just going to use the number 1,000 different requirements. So the commission then has to forbear. If it says this service is a telecommunications service under Title II, no longer an information service, it's a phone service like from 1934, which is hard to argue, but anyway, that would be the argument. Then are there all these requirements that we're going to forbear? We're not going to put all these requirements on you, at least not right now. And the big sword of Damocles that swings over ISPs' heads is retail rate regulation. But Tom Wheeler actually classified peering, the internet backbone, as a telecom service. So that's not retail, that's business, B2B. But said, look, we won't do retail rate regulation, but he and Phil Revere, his chief counsel at the time, said, but we might if ISPs don't behave. And so that was a way to nudge, some would say coerce, behavior by ISPs. But again, there was nothing broken, there was nothing going wrong to begin with that required the new regulatory regime. So Title II also has a lot of appellate history from 1934, which governs what the FCC can do. So for instance, zero rating, if an ISP wants to give its service away and it's not in an anti-competitive way, and by the way, under Title II, it can be discriminatory, but that just means like a higher volume user gets a volume discount. Right. Not discriminatory in that it's anti-competitive. So it means differentiation of product and service. Discriminatory is how that context is, to oversimplify it. But zero rating, if a common carrier is giving away its service, net neutrality advocates say that's not allowed. That shouldn't be allowed. We saw that also play out in India, by the way. Facebook was trying to give away internet service, and net neutrality proponents said you can't do that. Nowhere in the jurisprudence of Title II Does it say common carrier can't give away its product? If, so long as it's not anti-competitive, if it's not trying to,
Right.
undercut a rival or drive them out of business, for instance, that would be antitrust law. So that's why Title II gets sticky and complicated really fast, and the law of unintended consequences gets in motion right away. As soon as that order, the ink isn't even dry on the order, all of a sudden all these questions start getting asked. So that's why, I don't think any new statutory or regulatory regime is needed. You've got Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act. You've got the Clayton Act and the Sherman Act that prevents or makes presumptively illegal all of the parade of horribles that's always used every time to justify these regulations. But Congress, if they want, should look at it and not use Title II, but use something else that's more along the lines of competition law, which again, I think is already on the books. So.
Well, when you pair this issue with the one we started with, Section 230 and privacy issues, which we haven't talked so much about, I mean, I think it is, if not likely, at least possible that Congress could, over 2, 4, maybe more years, do some kind of a somewhat substantive rewrite of portions of the Telecom Act, including those I've just mentioned, with a particular emphasis on this net neutrality question, because again, that is the great uncertainty as to what rule. I mean, literally every telecom company needs to change its way of thinking every 4 years because of the change in the approach to net neutrality that's going to come out of the FCC. Is that not the case, Commissioner?
Absolutely. No, that is the case. So that toggling back and forth isn't healthy. It'd be great if we could kind of move on. But to your point too, 1996 was a long time ago, not just in Earth years, but in the evolution of the internet ecosphere, right? So just from an academic perspective, let alone good government, and that too, it probably deserves a fresh look. That, they passed with an overwhelming bipartisan majority. It was a Republican-controlled Senate, and President Clinton was a Democrat who signed it into law. Are those days gone forever? I hope not forever, but they're not in front of us right now, that's for sure. So I don't know if it's possible in the next Congress. But they all do. They need to look. It needs a refresh. That's for sure. There's a lot of archaic stuff in there.
Now, Commissioner, we've talked less about broadband access per se than some of these other regulatory issues, and I alluded at the start of the show that we actually began this Broadband Breakfast live online right as the coronavirus pandemic was becoming apparent as a major pandemic, had been declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. And I alluded to, hey, I had attempted to invite you to participate in one of our early programs, and you were not available because, as I understand it, you contracted the COVID-19. And I'm wondering if you have some reflections on a very serious journey you had on that topic, with that disease and your recovery. I hope has it been complete, and your thoughts on how we are living now, how we are communicating now as a result of broadband. So Commissioner, please tell us a little bit about what happened to you and what you've kind of reflected in the 6 months since then.
And thank you for asking, and I'll try to keep this part short. But so I contracted COVID. I was hit very hard by it, and it almost killed me. I later found out I had an 80% chance of dying, only a 20% chance of living. We don't know why, because I'm otherwise pretty healthy, have none of the advertised underlying risk factors. But this was early in the pandemic, so it became symptomatic on March 14th. And by March 23rd, long story short, I was hospitalized and was probably going to die. They wanted to intubate me, and I kind of fought that. But anyway, had a happy ending, and don't know exactly where I picked it up. I did have a trip to New York. I had a trip to New York March 8th, 9th, and 10th. I was following all CDC guidelines at that point, and you have to remember back then it was don't wear a mask because you'll be taking a mask away from a healthcare worker. I wasn't shaking hands. I was staying far apart from folks, but who knows? I might have picked up the European version of this, which I hear was more lethal. And I have type A blood with some blood protein. So males with type A blood and some blood protein have a higher morbidity rate, apparently. Anyway, so back to broadband.
Before we get back to broadband, though, do you have some thoughts on the state of the pandemic? And I mean, it's become a bit of a political issue. At least it was a political issue before the new political issue of the Supreme Court nomination. I mean, do you feel that America has kind of mishandled this as badly as many others do? I mean, having gone through it yourself?
I think we can, kibitz and 2020 hindsight. Now everybody's a virologist, right? We're all Nobel Award-winning virologists all of a sudden. So you can rewind the tape and listen to Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, in March, and find things then that they said that they would say differently now, or even were saying differently in May. And that's because there was a lot we didn't know about this particular disease. We had been through other, whether it was Ebola or H1N1, and they didn't, while H1N1 infected far more people more quickly, it ended up being not that lethal. So I'm not going to second guess the healthcare professionals, because we've been given a lot of contradicting advice in the past 6 months. It was supposed to also slow down during the summer because it didn't like warm, humid air.
Right.
So, we could point to a lot of, I guess they didn't know, right? So this is a unusual virus, and it's tricky. There's so much we don't know about it. Like, why did it almost kill me? We don't know. We'll find out someday after it doesn't matter anymore. And I'm just delighted I have the antibody right now, but I'm not going to second guess folks. The US is testing more than other countries. I think that skews a lot of the mortality rates, and especially in the developing world, it's really hard to tell why grandpa died. If there's no government official or someone doing an autopsy, there's no lab within 1,000 miles of grandpa to do a blood test on them. So we don't know, and it'll, years from now, we'll understand a lot more and hopefully learn from it. My great grandmother died in the Spanish flu epidemic when my grandfather was fighting in World War I. I have the letter he wrote to her from the front lines, not knowing his mom was dead. So that, anyway, I don't know why I told you that, but but broadband, we can go back to broadband. So broadband has held us together. I mean, the mobile internet, it's not perfect. Let me start off by saying a lot more people need to be connected. That will hopefully not always be the case. The general trajectory overall over the years, the past quarter century since the internet was privatized, more people are connected, and you're getting more faster speeds and more bandwidth at a lower price, even when adjusted for inflation, by orders of magnitude. And the spectrum auctions that we worked on, when I was a commissioner and since then, are coming to fruition. So the mobile internet in particular has been crucial to keeping alive. I can work from home. You can work from home. A lot of people can't work from home and they're unemployed, or they have to put themselves at risk. If you're a nurse or a surgeon or whatever, you have to be in person. But broadband, that connectivity, can you imagine going through this 30 years ago without the connectivity we have today? A lot more people would either be dead because they would have had to have gone out and they would have contracted the disease, or the economy would be, if you can imagine it, worse. So that is, I think we'll learn a lot. There's a lot more that can be done. Again, I'll keep saying that, but we should be grateful that we have what we have, I think.
Do you have any thoughts for the FCC about what they should be doing with the Universal Service Fund or E-rate, or ways to kind of, I mean, we would say quickly, but I mean, now it's long term, but the FCC is still not, in office, and that is to say in their downtown office, and probably won't be for many months to come. So we are kind of settling in for a long haul, it seems. What can be done in your view about kind of getting better broadband access quicker from a policy lever perspective, if anything, Commissioner?
So in the short run, because no one's ever done this, and by the way, interestingly, when Ebola and H1N1 were a thing, as a commissioner, I worked a bit on pandemic preparedness, and it kind of didn't go anywhere for both broadcasters and broadband, which is, people can't go to the office. What do you do? So it wasn't like this wasn't thought of, but nobody really know how it would hit. What can the FCC do? They've done a lot, whether it's the Keep Americans Connected pledge, so that folks wouldn't have their broadband connections disconnected due to lack of payment, although those chickens will come home to roost eventually, and soon, or giving waivers on the gift rules for things like E-rate, or giving waivers on spectrum use, so that all of a sudden wireless carriers or others can use more spectrum because more people are working from home or going to school from home. So there's a lot that the FCC can do, which basically amounts to kind of either getting out of the way. The FCC can't print money, and it has about an $8 billion a year universal service fund or different funds under that umbrella, and it can't spend it faster than it gets it. But I think they've done as good a job as anyone could have hoped to keep people connected. Like, probably more will have to be done, as we do see on the broadband connectivity pledge, the fact that has now expired. ISPs are carrying a big bad debt load, and while more people are going back to work, they have diminished unemployment benefits now. So I think there's something that Congress could do there. I don't know if it's the FCC so much. There's only so long that a company can provide free service and then be expected to build out 5G. So,
should it be part of the next stimulus, kind of funding for broadband connectivity?
And I have worked on that, and full disclosure, I have some clients who are in support of that, but it is a, broadband connectivity voucher was one idea of it would be targeted and to keep people connected and means tested. So I think that would be a noble endeavor because this is going to be around. We're, hopefully this time next year, by far the worst will be over and we'll be well under our way to healing. But into the spring, I think we'll all still be working from home for the most part.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful hour to spend with you and talk with you. Any final thoughts or suggestions for our audience?
Just, I've had a couple of brushes with death in my life, this year being one of them, the most recent, hopefully the last one for a while. So just try to enjoy every day. This is a tough time on all of us psychologically. We're disconnected from people. We are social creatures. I see it in my, kids who are restricted from what they can do at school and myself. So try to reach out, do the best you can, be in touch with all the sort of the psychological unintended consequences of this pandemic, but be grateful you have broadband connections to kind of bring that back full circle, because we're much better off as a result of what industry has done and public policy over the past couple of decades.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Commissioner. And just a reminder to please join us next week to hear from Sonny McPeak. If we could all clap, we would clap for the wonderful time and insight we've gained from Commissioner Rob McDowell. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. See you next week at 12 noon Eastern Time. Take care.